Good afternoon from a very hot Berlin, and good morning to colleagues from the United States. My name is Andrew Gilmore. I'm the Executive Director of the Berghoff Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to the latest version of our Berghoff Special Events series on various topics relating to peace and conflict. And today we bring you a really important issue, but actually a strangely neglected one, and as well as some of the most thoughtful practitioners on the international scene. And it marks the launch of a new book that was literally arrived in our hands yesterday, Human Rights and Mediation by Katarina and Månsson. It's an exceptionally good book, and we're very proud of it and her. And in brief, I just wanted those two topics, human rights and mediation, are two areas of activity that should be natural allies. I mean, they share the ultimate goals after all. No human rights activist doesn't want peace, and no mediator, more or less, doesn't want to see human rights progress. Nevertheless, there are times when there are some unfortunate tensions between the two. And I know a little bit what I'm talking about here, because I have served on both sides of the divide and can testify to, and indeed perhaps even a little bit shamefacedly admit to having contributed a little bit to the caricature images that persist on both sides. I mean, in a nutshell, the human rights crowd can sometimes see mediators as not sufficiently principled, or almost cynical, ready to push a quick fix, desperate to prevent any rocking of the diplomatic boat, and by the pesky allegation put forward by human rights, of human rights violations. Conversely, mediators can sometimes view human rights people as being prone to being overly moralistic and underly politically sensitive, and too quick to give megaphonic sermons. Both caricatures are inaccurate, but as is often the case, caricatures contain a germ of truth, but not much more than that. So how to get both sides to recognize the full value of the other? It's a topic incredibly close to my heart, and Berghoff, I think, is actually quite well placed to do that. It's a 52-year-old organization working, the largest and oldest, working on peace and conflict issues in Germany, and it working in many parts of the world, but it's a very much a values-driven organization too. And this is what this excellent book is all about. And aside from the author, who will be summarizing her findings, we have three heavy hitters from the UN who will be discussing the findings of the book and their own experiences, as well as a senior official from Finland, a country that is very strong on both human rights and mediation. The meeting is public and is being recorded. And after the five speakers we have, that should take us for about 50 minutes. I hope we will then have about 20 minutes for question and answers that I would invite people to put into the question and answer channel here. So I'd like to start with Ilze Kehris. You are the UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. Based in New York, unlike other people in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, your job, as I see it, is not so much to interact with other human rights experts, but rather to interact with everyone else and to try to persuade people, sometimes a little bit skeptical of the values of a human rights approach. And it's uphill work, I know that. The emphasis of Katarina's book is the need to convince mediators that human rights can be of use to them. For you, though, that is obviously not an issue. You don't need any convincing. So my question to you, though, is what can the human rights community do to help convince the mediators, and therefore, and also to arrange the human rights tools that your crowd knows really, really well, but few others do, actually, and to arrange those in such a way that it's not just about naming and shaming, but it can actively promote the peace agenda. Over to you, Ilze.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's a wonderful pleasure to be here. I'm very happy to be with you and with Berghoff Foundation. So I want to start off by thanking you for keeping, I would like to say, a series of discussions, but it was all too long last year, I think, when we did the last time, on bringing human rights, conflict resolution, prevention really sustainable peace altogether. And indeed, with your very special background and interest, I think you're so well placed to do that. But it's particularly a pleasure this time, of course, to be here with Katarina and for the launch of this book. Her great achievement in a very short few months, when she really put into it all her passion and her great work capacity to produce, I think, this very valuable work. Again, as you said, curiously under-researched topic, strangely so, because I think there is a very natural fit within for human rights and mediation, but really energizing the discussion, and hopefully we will have a lot of follow-up to that as well. I'm also very happy to have the eminent speakers that I will continue to learn from, who are following here. So very, very briefly, because I know we have only a few, or I have a few minutes, just a short caveat that I think sometimes we talk about mediation in different ways, and of course all of those, and I'm sure here in the room, in the space we are at, there are many who are experts on mediation. Sometimes we tend to conflate it with facilitation, or facilitating or supporting dialogues, national dialogues, or even good offices in many ways. Of course, as we know, with all due respect for the very real expertise and very advanced work done by actual mediation, and to keep that in mind when we also, because there are, I would say that human rights relate to all of those different ways of engaging with parties to a conflict or a potential conflict, but of course it's very specific in the case of mediation. I'd like to mark also that I think it's particularly topical now also because the complexity of conflicts is increasing, as we know, both the types of conflicts, the types of conflict actors, also the very different sub-state actors, and the cross-border aspects, the external engagements, the influences from which all make mediation more difficult and complex. But also, of course, finding that niche of what the human rights really can offer in that context is equally complex. The multitude of mediation actors, as Katarina notes as well in the book, of course, means that we need to take special care in making sure that we're coherent. And obviously, the national ownership goes not only for mediators, but also for us. We know, of course, that whether root causes, consequences, or solutions, again, of conflict, it's clear that the link, many of those really directly relate to human rights. So there is a natural link, and this is something that we need to explore. It's evident. There are general accepted principles for mediation, the ones that are often referred to: inclusion, of course, rule of law, justice, both broad and holistic in the approach, equality, non-discrimination, participation. All of those are actually human rights concepts. So it's a question also maybe of having the approach and the understanding based in human rights that can help to really unpack what we really mean, what kind of inclusion, who should be included, and what that means, and also bringing, focusing on solutions. We have a UN focus here, but of course, again, it's not the only actor, and not only the national ownership we need to look at, but of course, also increasingly we have the regional and sub-regional and other efforts at mediation. So I think, again, that caveat, including non-governmental ones, particularly pertinent in this context with you at Berghof. But I think there too, we need to make sure that we identify also the role, the added value that we can have. So I think for the UN, we have the Secretary General's call to action for human rights that remind us of two key things that I think are very relevant here. One is the jointness of action of the UN. So bringing together, even within the UN, the mediation teams and mediation experts with human rights experts, but also human rights as a solution. So again, going away from that mere finger-pointing perception of human rights, but what do human rights have to offer? I know I'm running out of time, so I'll just very quickly point to a few of those in answer also to your question. I think the arguments we have to offer why human rights are necessary, and of course, Katarina's book does this brilliantly, I think. One is the analysis and the information. The monitoring and reporting is not merely naming and shaming, but it should be used really to have a full picture of what actually is going on the ground. We need to have that joint analysis with the political side, with the social economic analysis, with all that goes into it, a true interdisciplinary approach. So human rights should really be at the core of that, and we do have that to offer. Of course, we often talk about the objective framework that we have with human rights. It's really the universality of it. It's challenged in a narrative, we know, but of course we can deal with that in various ways, as Katarina points out, also making sure that we anchor in regional and local norms, traditions, and so on, but still coming back to the objectivity of the framework and what that has to offer. It can build trust with parties, the legitimacy, both for local and external actors to engage. And then some of those concepts, as I pointed to, inclusion, for instance, making sure that inclusion has that human rights lens, and we can offer something in terms of how to approach that. Justice, we don't have time now, but the transitional justice, I just want to point out that there was this summer, we have a recent new Secretary General guidance note on transitional justice that broadens the approach of transitional justice. And I think there we really, the reminder of having not only people at the center as in all mediation efforts, and sometimes that's forgotten as we know, but victims at the center. And this is a key thing where I think that human rights lens, including to transitional justice, and as part of these processes in mediation, even both immediate and longer term, is very important. So the importance that Katarina really points to on the holistic approach with human rights, but also recognizing that we need to have a sequence, there needs to be a plan. So for the human rights community to convince mediators and others that we really are a good partner to have is also to admit that we need to be not only pragmatic and see what can be done in certain contexts, but also understanding that there is a sequence to things and not everything can necessarily be done at the same time. Just two very one-sentence mentions. One is that human rights, and I think we know, all of us, that many of the conflicts that are there in the world have ethnic, religious, and other dimensions. So I would like to point to, and Katarina has a little bit of that in the book as well, the importance of human rights, including minority rights. Again, going to human rights as a toolbox, what human rights really can offer. And of course, there's a whole big separate toolbox of minority rights, underutilized for sure by the United Nations itself and arguably by other mediators as well. Ethnic, cultural, linguistic, religious minorities, all of them, and the rights that can help to solve grievances and address those. And I would like to mention that there will be also a practice note that DPPA, the political department, and OHCHR has produced together on enhancing mediation through human rights, and that's forthcoming very shortly this year. That of course is meant to be used with examples of tools that can be used practically to enhance quality and effectiveness of mediation work. And it really goes very much hand in hand with Katarina's great work on this one. And therefore, I finish by saying thank you very much to Katarina, a reminder to all of us, including the human rights community, the humility we know that mediators often say is one of the key points of mediators, qualities that mediators have to have. Of course, the human rights community also need to remember that same call. We're in it together, and the collaborative effort is really something we need to enhance. And I'm very, very happy to see that Katarina has added her piece to that enhancement. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilze. Katarina, you are the author of this book, and I was wondering now if you would kindly present to us all the key findings of it, and maybe present one or two of the most the best examples. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And first of all, really my sincere thanks to the Berghoff Foundation and to you, Andrew, and for all the staff involved at the Berghoff Foundation for your support and for hosting me during my sabbatical leave, and really for bringing this topic to the public domain and have this discussion in the public area by publishing the book and for organizing today's event. And I'm also really honored and very humble to be presenting alongside such an outstanding panel of real experts on the topic. And I would like to just also very briefly thank you, Andrew, on a more personal note, for maybe unknowingly directing me to this topic, as I did have the pleasure of working with you, both in your capacity as the director of the political unit in the executive office of the Secretary General from 2012 to 2016, and thereafter, of course, as the ASG for Human Rights in New York, which I also had a fantastic pleasure of working with Ilze for 4 years in that capacity. And as you both were mentioning at the outset, that work at United Nations headquarters is intimately connected around how to advance integration of human rights into the 3 pillars of the organization, including in political processes. And I think the complexities of this nexus are particularly acute in the field of mediation. How can human rights help shape political decisions? How can it shape an outcome of a peace process? And hence also the political future of societies emerging from conflict. So I want to thank both of you for really inspiring me to explore this fascinating area. So for this to happen as in mediation, and as the book emphasizes, and both of you emphasize, that we need so much greater joining of the dots, as one interviewee mentioned, between human rights experts and mediation experts. And all interviews that I spoke with, and I spoke with almost 60 senior and other representatives from the United Nations, from non-official intermediators like the Berghoff Foundation. All interviewees on both sides agreed that there's a need to step up the conversation and for joint action and analysis, as Ilze was saying, on this topic. And I argue in the book that this actually, it's a mutual opportunity for both sides, because ultimately, as the title of my research indicates, human rights ultimately does stand at the heart of mediation. It's the cause and consequence of conflict very often, but also therefore the very building blocks of durable and lasting peace. And I wish to quote Jeffrey Feltman, the former Undersecretary General for Political Affairs at the United Nations, who said to me, human rights is the starting point why you engage in mediation. The question is how you maintain human rights throughout the process. So the book really seeks to shed some light on the question of the how, because I think we all agree on the why. And so how to effectively integrate human rights in mediation, and how human rights, as you were both mentioning, can support mediators in their task to resolve conflict peacefully. And in this regard, the book, the research was a direct contribution to the joint project that Ilze Kehris mentioned between DPPA and OHHR on the same topic. Now, before I turn to some of the findings of the case studies, I wanted to highlight one of the research's key findings, and that is what many said was an urgency to return to the fundamentals. And with that, I mean the nexus between human rights and peace, and the role of mediators of bringing the two together, that is in fact firmly established in the UN Charter. And when I did the research, I also went to see how the drafters were discussing this topic when they formulated the Charter. And fascinatingly enough, the majority of the drafters were convinced that the fulfillment of human rights and the full spectrum of human rights, from economic and social, right to work, right to food, as well as civil and political rights, right to participation, were the condition for peace, both within but also between states. And it was particularly the smaller states, the delegates from smaller states, that were adamant that what the world needed was an organization that would advance a peace founded on social justice, not a peace of political expediency. And hence the human rights were the tool for that. And that is actually why Article 1, Paragraph 1 of the UN Charter makes it clear that a core purpose of the organization is, and I quote, to bring about by peaceful means and in conformity with the principles of justice and international law, adjustment of international disputes or situations which might lead to a breach of the peace. And so that inclusion of the reference to in conformity with principles of justice and international law was an outcome of the push of many delegates to ensure that human rights and peace went hand in hand. And right there, in the very first article of the Charter, it underscores that mediation processes actually need to conform with human rights. So this strong link between fundamental rights and the peaceful settlement of disputes at the very establishment of the UN back in 1945 may also be one reason why the very first UN mediator, Count Volker Bernadotte, also adopted this approach in his efforts to mediate the conflict in Palestine. And it was fascinating to see that actually in his very last progress report to the General Assembly in September 1948, he identified that the political, economic, social, and religious rights of all Arabs in the Jewish territory of Palestine and of all Jews in the Arab territory should be fully guaranteed and respected by the authorities. And he identified those as among the special conditions which in his views could provide for a reasonable, equitable, and workable basis for the settlement. And this was even before the adoption of the Universal Declaration in December 1948. So already the first mediator of the UN emphasized that equal protection of rights of all inhabitants in Palestine was the key founding element of his vision for a peaceful settlement. So many interviewees underscored that this return to fundamentals is of particular importance today in the changing world where we know how the basic tenets of international law are under attack. And as Ilze mentioned, we see an increasingly fragmented mediation field. And many interviewees were concerned at the fact that the plurality of mediation actors give parties to conflict today the option of turning to non-normative mediators, and which will leave out human rights considerations. And I found that human rights were indeed not at the forefront of some non-official intermediaries. And the reasons given, and they are understandable and they're valid, was that in their view, bringing in human rights may close the door for engagement, but also, and this is an important issue, that human rights are not well understood concepts to many of the local organizations and groups with whom these organizations work. And yet another important reality that many pointed to in today's conflict is that in the power politics in which mediation is concerned, human rights may actually not be more than a footnote. And this is a reality, we know. And in such context, it becomes so important, as both you, Andrew, and Ilze mentioned, that the human rights community engages and explains and convinces how human rights can help a mediator's very complex political context and offer solutions. And this brings me to the first how, so to speak, of the book. And that is the importance of strengthening a holistic understanding of human rights within the mediation community. Human rights are so much more than individual criminal responsibility, which oftentimes is the very real and difficult dimensions that mediators are confronted with. But by bringing in the more full spectrum of human rights actors can help mediators to actually map and identify structural dimensions and origins of conflict much better. It's expanding the toolbox, so to speak, to understand the drivers of conflict and hence offer tools to engage on those difficult. And interviewees pointed out that, in fact, economic, social, cultural rights have so far been an underrated element of mediation and appeal for greater attention. And among my case studies, the peace process in Colombia between 2012 and 16 perhaps best exemplifies a process which included attention to economic and social cultural rights of people living in rural areas, including their land rights. And in doing so, the peace process actually aimed not only at the peace, but really at the structural transformation of society. And that's what human rights is all about, in addition to justice for victims. And so in this context, many interviewees pointed to that human rights in Colombia was actually a roadmap for creating sustainable peace. Now, the centrality of the political and power in mediation processes leads me to the second element of the how that many interviewees pointed to. And that was the importance of speaking to the self-interest of parties. And that is really where the balancing act between, on the one hand, human rights actors feel very strongly about, speaking truth to power, with what mediators are concerned with, retaining consent of the parties. And as Ilze mentioned, actually, this came to the forefront in my interviews with former High Commissioners on National Minorities of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. This was is a unique conflict resolution mechanism established in '92 to provide early warning and early action regarding tensions involving minority issues. And the very first High Commissioner for National Minorities, Max van der Stoel, defined that role as one of a facilitator working with the parties to find compromise solutions to inter-ethnic problems. And he found in the OSCE's so-called human dimension, which includes human rights, that was for him the heart of the matter of the undertaking. So I must confess that Max van der Stoel actually inspired me to use that topic also for the book, because it is really the heart of the matter. And he engaged, among other contexts, in Ukraine in the 1990s, where he worked specifically to find these compromise solutions based on minority rights framework to find solutions that were agreeable to both sides of the conflict. That included protection of linguistic rights, but also political participation for national minorities. And I wanted to also to emphasize that, in fact, appealing to the self-interest of parties can be that way, as Ilze mentioned, of emphasizing the problem-solving capacity of human rights. It doesn't mean compromising on their standing and their principles, but it means, and here I wish to paraphrase Professor John Packer, who worked very closely with the High Commissioner on National Minorities, it means the interpreting norms against the specific context with the view to finding political solutions and the ability of conveying them convincingly to authorities. And this leads me to the third issue of the how, that all interviewees also emphasized, and both of you mentioned it in the beginning, and that is the importance of humility and the ability of incentivizing and communicating persuasively on human rights. And here I wish to highlight the work of former Finnish President Martti Ahtisaari, and in particular here in his role as mediator of the Aceh peace process from January to August 2005. Halfway through the negotiation process between the government of Indonesia and the Free Aceh movement, GAM, he received reports of ongoing cases of torture, of rape, of disappearances committed by the Indonesian armed forces in the Aceh province. And this was at the time where he was with the parties of both sides in Helsinki trying to negotiate a framework for peaceful conflict. Now, having received these reports, it prompted him to leave those negotiations, travel to Jakarta with a detailed report prepared by GAM, and presented it to the president, to the vice president, to parliament, to political actors and so forth in Indonesia. And he wanted to tell them, and I quote from a book on his work, he wanted to tell them that if the negotiations failed, at least they knew why, and that if the abuses continued, peace would come to nothing. And shortly thereafter, the state of emergency in Aceh was lifted, the abuses decreased, and the negotiations actually back in Helsinki turned into a more constructive and accelerated further to that intervention. And that, I think this is an excellent example because it showed that the mediator himself pointed to the parties that ongoing abuses were unacceptable, and it could actually bring an end to the entire peace process. And his approach, which I wanted to highlight, is that, and I will quote here from a book about his work, because it points to the issue of humility. And he said, and it says that Ahtisaari, when he went to Jakarta, he had not come wagging his finger to say, "What on earth are you doing?" His way was to present the problem, i.e. the peace process is in danger of failing, and gather everyone to think about how we can solve the problem together, even though the generals, of course, were without doubt part of the problem. And here I would like to quote Ahtisaari. I listened to an interview with him, and he said that the greatest compliment ever given to him was from one representative from a party of conflict saying, "I would like to work half a year with you to learn how to say difficult things in a nice manner." So that this is an excellent example also, Matti Ahtisaari, of mediators themselves taking human rights to heart and taking the initiative of human rights dialogue in the middle of a mediation process. One mediation expert during the research said that is actually when mediators themselves are the carriers of human rights is the best way to actually ensure that the mediation is infused with human rights. Another example of a proactive approach of a mediator himself in the peace process is the case of El Salvador, where Alvaro de Soto was the Secretary General's personal representative of the Central American peace process from 90 to 92. Now, whereas so unrestricted respect for human rights were identified in the Geneva Accords in 1990 as one of the three purposes for the negotiation process, it was actually de Soto himself who proposed and prepared, with the support of the then Center for Human Rights in Geneva, which is now today the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and judicial experts, he prepared, with the support of the Center for Human Rights, a draft agreement on human rights. And that became actually the first substantive agreement as part of the leading up to the final peace agreement in 92. And how did this, I was interested to hear from Alvaro de Soto, how was this possible? And this happened 3 months into the negotiation process, where the government of El Salvador and the FMLN, the leftist guerrilla group, were stuck in disagreements about the status of their armed forces. De Soto proactively proposed to change the topic and the focus of the negotiations to human rights. And that was agreed. He traveled to Geneva. The draft agreement was developed. And in a very short period of time, actually overnight, the parties agreed to the text. And I think part of that, as Alvaro de Soto mentioned, was that many of the elements in that agreement were based on human rights provisions of treaties that El Salvador had already committed to. And of course, that brings us to the many other factors that need to come into play for human rights to actually be able to have an impact and to be retained during the negotiation process. And that was international support, international pressure. There was a group of mediators, group of friends of the mediation process that, pressured both sides of the negotiation table to agree. But it still points to the important fact that mediators themselves can be and have been carriers of human rights. And now I'll be running out of time, so I will just say that the final and perhaps the most critical how. And Ilze mentioned that in the beginning, and that is the importance of placing victims and their rights at the center. And again, the peace process of Colombia is unique in this regard, as it presented the first time ever that victims of conflict were invited to give direct testimony to the negotiation parties. And this was a watershed moment in the peace process, and it's also credited for a radical change in FARC's position of victims that culminated in an apology to the Colombian people. And the former resident coordinator in Colombia at the time, he noted that the participation of victims, but also the popular consultations with civil society across all regions of Colombia, constituted the two most important elements that automatically allowed human rights to be included in the peace process. And I also very briefly wanted to indicate that Colombia was critical in the criminal justice aspect in its special jurisdiction for peace, which actually allowed for reduced sentences for those who confessed, as long as they lay down their arms and recognize their responsibility and contribute to victims' rights, to truth, reparation, non-repetition, and justice. And that, I think that is an important example for ongoing and future peace processes. So I would like to finish now. I'm sorry I've taken too much time. I just wanted to say that the one important element of human rights is, as Ilze was mentioned, it's an objective and impartial framework that actually presents a mediator with in unparalleled legitimacy and credibility in a mediation process. And it brings me to the fact that the importance is to actually to go back to the fundamentals, that we need to protect the basic rock of this framework, and it's a joint responsibility and an act of mutual opportunity. So thank you very much and for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Katarina. The next speaker is Bintu Keita, who's the SRSG in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Is Bintu there? Because if not, because I can't see, if not, I will go to the next speaker, who is Outi Holopainen. If I don't see Bintu's face come up in the next 5 seconds, Outi, can I turn to you, please? Outi is the Under-Secretary of State for Political Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Finland and has just taken up that position. And I think I mentioned before you joined, Finland is a great supporter of both mediation and human rights. And by the way, this book that we are launching has been produced thanks to generous contributions by both the Swiss and the Finnish governments. We're very grateful for that. Outi, as a government that, like us, is trying to sort of bring the two communities, the two disciplines together, I was wondering if you could give perhaps a member state's perspective of that, somebody who is very supportive of both.
Okay, thank you, Excellencies and dear audience. So, and sorry, I missed the very beginning of the event, so if I repeat something that has been already said, so please excuse me. But let me first thank the Berghoff Foundation, which is also Finland's partner, as you heard, and Mr. Andrew Gilmore, of course, for inviting me to speak here. And it's a great pleasure to speak here in my new capacity, in my very new capacity. I started as Under Secretary of State only about 10 days ago. But also I could mention that in my previous capacity as Finland's ambassador to Ethiopia, where I was based in Addis Ababa for 3 years, I had the opportunity to meet some of the Berghoff staff members and have good exchanges about the developments in the region. So I would like to thank Katarina Månsson for her extremely interesting research and congratulate for the huge task that she has carried out, and of course the other speakers that I was able to hear before my own intervention. So an extremely interesting topic, and I am glad to share some thoughts on how Finland sees the combination of these two important dimensions, which are priority areas for Finland, as Andrew mentioned. But let me start by linking the topic of the day to the Finnish foreign policy more broadly, because there are things happening in the world and things happening in our region and Finland as well. So just to put the things into the context. So we are all painfully aware of the fact that the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 changed the security environment in Europe very dramatically. And Finland, as another neighboring country of Russia, drew the conclusion. And as you might know, so Finland applied for NATO membership, and that was materialized in April this year. So that was, of course, a very big change for Finland's security policy. We also have a new government since June, and the political color of the government changed, as often happens in the elections, though it is good to remember that in Finland we always have coalition governments. So that means that they are not prone to very extreme extremist positions or major shifts. So I would like to just underline that in spite of the recent changes in our environment and in some parts of our, especially security policy, so the fundamentals of the Finnish foreign policy remain the same. We are working, we continue to work for peace and stability, and we are aiming at bridge building rather than confrontation. Respect for and promotion of human rights continues to be a cornerstone for our policies domestically and also in our international relations. That goes without saying. The current government program explicitly states that Finland's foreign and security policy remains based on the rule of law, human rights, equality, and democracy. Also, Finland will do its part in encouraging the countries in the global south to commit to rules-based order, democracy, and the promotion of human rights. Peace mediation has been a priority already for several Finnish governments, and it's again mentioned in the government program. It forms an integral part of Finland's foreign policy, supporting the multilateral system, rules-based international order, peaceful resolution of conflicts, and conflict prevention. I think we all agree that peace is not only absence of violent conflicts. It's much more. It's human security, inclusive and democratic societies, and respect for human rights. Peace mediation is meant not only to serve the leaders to strike a deal, but it also should benefit their people. And this is also the foundation for Finland's approach to conflict prevention and sustainable peace. In peace processes, we think it's of utmost importance to create solutions that protect and fulfill human rights. For true reconciliation to take place, victims of violations must get justice. As the previous speakers and Katarina herself said, so we know exactly why, but we don't really know how. However, so I can say that it's not a straightforward process, and Katarina referred to our great man, Martti Ahtisaari, our ex-president and a great peace mediator, and his experiences. So as Katarina was telling about the experiences in Aceh, they were successful at the end, but it was a long and winding road and very tricky process. And to get human rights included in the process, it was not so simple, but it doesn't mean that it should not be done. Also today, we recognize the challenges related to the integration of human rights in peace mediation, which Katarina very insightfully describes in her research. In the same insightful way, she also identifies 7 core answers to the question how to better integrate human rights in mediation. And I would like to raise just some practical aspects of Finnish peace mediation, which I think could support the approach. First, about institutional structures. So on national level, we established 3 years ago the Center for Peace Mediation at the political department of our ministry, which is the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Finland. The center has a very specific role of planning, development, implementation, and coordination of peace mediation activities. As a result, peace mediation is now being used at the ministry more widely and proactively, building on broader expertise in other fields, such as human rights. In international level then, in our efforts to facilitate and mediate sustainable peace, we need cooperation with diverse actors, of course. Finland strongly supports strengthening UN's role in mediation and partnerships between the UN, member states, regional organizations, and civil society actors. We also think that the UN new agenda for peace is an opportunity to develop UN's diplomatic toolbox further to address the issue of human rights. Second, about partnerships and networking. The Center for Peace Mediation at the Foreign Ministry is cooperating closely with civil society and coordinating with other actors in peacemaking. We have excellent Finnish NGOs and private actors in the field of peace and mediation, but we also partner with international and regional governmental and non-governmental organizations, including Berghof. We also use networking approach. The Ministry for Foreign Affairs has established 2 networks. I just tell them as an example: the Water Diplomacy Network, comprising Finnish water expertise, and the Finnish branch of Nordic Women Mediators, which gathers leading Finnish professionals in peace and security. The ministry also supports some international networks within peace mediation sector, such as the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemakers. Third, about the holistic approach to human rights. Inequalities are significant drivers of conflict and can easily trigger violence, as we know. It's a very important observation that in peace mediation, giving more emphasis to economic, social, and cultural rights could steer the process towards a more holistic approach to human rights. Also, in international human rights fora, Finland has been active in advocating for economic, social, and cultural rights, and for the principle of bringing them to an equal footing with civil and political rights. Holistic approach to human rights is also closely linked to inclusivity, issues of meaningful participation and non-discrimination. Inclusivity is key to sustainable peace. Whatever we talk about formal or informal dialogues or peace processes, local ownership and inclusiveness are crucial for lasting peace. Particular attention should be paid for ensuring access to meaningful participation for women, youth, the civil society, as well as the traditional religious actors and marginalized groups, such as persons with disabilities. Dear audience, I hope this is only the beginning of the discussion on how to better integrate human rights in peace mediation. I also hope that Katarina Månsson's book will spark dialogue between peace mediation and human rights actors in specific conflict contexts in order to come up with concrete cooperation. As UN Secretary Kofi Annan used to put it very clearly, there is no peace without development. There is no development without peace, and there is no peace and development without human rights. So thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador Holopainen. I understand now that the SRSG in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Bintu Keita, is now online. Could we, Bintu, are you there, please? It's on my, the audience won't see it, but I can see her office is in, but maybe the technology there isn't stretched to actually bring her in. While we wait for her, we have 2 questions. They seem a bit, they're ostensibly very different topics. One is the Ukraine and Russia, and I'm getting messages saying that Bintu Keita is there, but I don't see her. No, I'm sorry. One is about Ukraine and Russia, and do we believe that enough effort by mediators is going in to achieve peace in that region? And the other is about addressing human rights violations in situations where terrorists and extremists are in control of certain contexts. Now, the similarity of that, in my view, my personal view, and I'll just answer that because it may be easier for me than serving members of the UN to answer that. When you get a party to a conflict that has started the conflict and is also not really interested in mediation, except is only interested in complete victory, and on the other hand, is very ready, and actually it's part of the designs to carry out war crimes, as in both of these instances, I think it's very hard for both mediators and human rights people to really make much headway. And I do think that there are people who are very ready to try to bring peace, but a peace that's sort of in accordance with the UN Charter, which means that sort of a major unprovoked aggression shouldn't be allowed to stand. And in the case of where extremists are in control of large parts of territory, ISIS being one example, or Al Qaeda, or various other, or many others, it is virtually impossible to do much to promote human rights. Not only is their conception of human rights radically different to most people in our world, particularly when it comes to women and on other gender issues, but similarly, some of the readiness to commit what we see as war crimes, it is very hard to do anything. And which doesn't mean, though, that on the other side, that there shouldn't be respect for human rights. And this is something that I feel very strongly about and have written about. For example, where these camps where former ISIS fighters' wives and children are being kept, I think it is absolutely terrible that the countries whose citizens they're from haven't let them back in. But making it, I don't know if either of the other panelists would care. It might be easier for you, Outi, than the UN to answer that question, but particularly about Russia and Ukraine. But so if we persist in not being able to get Bintu Keita in, then I think, Outi, would you care to say something about human rights and mediators on the Ukraine conflict?
Yeah, I could say, okay, now I think we will also.
I saw a face.
Okay.
It's not quite like Bintu Keita, but
at least there is a picture now.
This is a picture.
Yeah. But if I comment your question, or the question that was from the audience, I guess I start with the other part. So when territories are occupied by terrorist groups or other like extremists, and it's difficult to intervene, and the human rights violations are ongoing, I think the only sustainable tool is to then, of course, in the long run, fight against impunity and create international structures for that. So if not at that moment, it's when it's not possible at that very moment to intervene, at least then have the try to do something like later on. So that is something that is, of course, one possibility, but of course very, very difficult in practice. But we definitely aim at fighting the impunity and making sure that those who commit these terrible crimes will be in, that they are brought to justice at some point. And that applies, of course, also to the war that is ongoing in Europe. So if war crimes are committed, at some point there should be also the phase when the criminals are punished, those responsible for the crimes. For the mediation, of course, it is very difficult. The practitioners of mediation, I'm sure they can tell better that it requires this certain moment when the mediation really can work out, and so it has to take into consideration the realities on the ground and also the conditions on which like a sustainable and just peace could take place.
Thank you so much, Outi, for improvising as well. I'm looking at other questions because I see movement in Kinshasa, but certainly not Bintu's face. Outi, there's one question: how does Finland ensure that mediation efforts it supports addresses human rights issues effectively? Do you have an answer to that?
Well, I think one issue is exactly how we organize our own work. So we try to work well together, also like horizontally in our own organization, in our own ministry, so that the people working more on the mediation side have a close cooperation with those more experts in human rights. But of course, human rights issues are mainstreamed in all our activities. So at certain level, of course, in everything that we do, we take into consideration human rights. But of course, for the deeper knowledge and expertise, we then turn on our experts in the human rights, in the unit for human rights policy, and other experts, of course. I mentioned the networks and how we work with different organizations. So that's part of adding the expertise to the work that we are doing. So I think that's the Finnish way of working. So it's not only at the level of between like official actors, it's also very much with like non-governmental organizations that we work.
Yeah, thank you very much. Ilze, what Juan Diaz says, no mediator disputes the importance of human rights. Mediators cannot support any solutions that violate human rights. Well, they can actually. I mean, they shouldn't, but I have to say they sometimes have done. Could the speakers address what is the main problem with mediators specifically? Obviously within limits, as I can't speak so much on sort of criticism of mediators. But what do you have a position on that? On what is to be expected from them?
Well, I think that's a great question for discussion, actually, and where it would be good to really have a dialogue on it, because I think it's very important, as you pointed out, Andrew, to begin with. I think, and Katarina actually does in the book as well, is that there's a lot of misperceptions on both sides of these communities about what the other side is doing. So I actually happen to be belonging to a more optimistic group of people, and including maybe, Andrew, because of what you were pointing to, that in the New York office of the High Commissioner, we really are constantly dealing with the political side of the decision-making, the intergovernmental side, but of course also on specific issues when we work with our UN colleagues. So I actually do believe that there is and I mentioned very briefly when I intervened on some of the basic principles that gradually have been fully incorporated in for mediation as such, actually are human rights principles. But it's a matter of maybe of finding those, really connecting the dots, as Katarina was saying, to be able to unpack what it really means when we talk about the inclusion, when we talk about, and even the process design, but also the kinds of tools that human rights actually can offer. So I really do think that mediators, generally speaking, and I think you were making the same point, are actually maybe more open to the human rights aspects as a principled approach to mediation than is commonly believed by some in the human rights community. But maybe it's a matter of really making sure that we're more aware of exactly the toolbox. And I think Katarina made a very important point as well in the book and in her presentation, on using the full range of human rights, because when we have this misperception of the human rights people, and sometimes it's not a misperception, there are some human rights advocates who do come in with the finger pointing exclusively and with calling out all the violations and wanting immediate responses to it. But the point is really having that holistic approach to understanding that human rights is about all the human rights, and the underutilization of the social, economic, cultural rights part of it, in finding those solutions, which is both in the immediate sort of cessation of hostility phase, which may be the more acute one, and of course civil political rights, and the examples even Katarina gave, including of that dramatic moment with Martti Ahtisaari finding out that you're in the middle of something that should be mediation and something is ongoing. Of course, you have to address that issue immediately, but to at the same time have that perspective of the sequencing and the longer term, that you are talking about a sustainable solution to a situation. And I actually do believe that there's those, it's a matter of finding the entry points and the dialogue between the human rights experts and the mediation experts. And I'm very pleased to hear about the Finnish example, where those connections, even within a foreign ministry, for instance, at that national level, when it's prioritized, should be done, but all the more so among all of the other mediator experts. Just one thing I think for that is Another aspect that maybe is quite challenging, I think that for very obviously serious mediation efforts, it's such a long, sustained, daily interaction and very intense exercise that of course has to be fully bought into by all the parties you're mediating between. And at the same time, it's something where you can't sort of just helicopter in and think you're going to solve something and then move. And in that sense, it's also important to look at where the human rights expertise comes in. It has to be contextual, of course. So you have to have, and for the UN, I would argue for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the advantages may be in those places where we have a strong presence in the field, because there we have the expertise that has that correlation of really knowing the context, including history, including culture, including understanding and being able to speak the language of those that you are mediating between, without which, of course, you cannot be successful. And the human rights presences, I think, in having those local networks, for instance, of local community outreach. Sometimes mediators, maybe one criticism that could be done, and human rights, by the way, tend to do the same sometimes, is that with the primacy of the responsibility lies with the governments, as we know, and then we have the leaders of various other parties that we mediate between. So there tends to be an underestimation of the importance of involving local communities and community leaders. And that's why when I mentioned, and again echoing Katarina on the importance of victims, which is victim-centered as human rights, but I even go beyond that in saying the people-centered, that really remembering that when we're talking that multiple channels and bringing on board, mobilizing that community in each case that we're dealing with, whether that is then from the mediation perspective or the human rights perspective. And I think that human rights can add to that in often having, particularly when the presence is there on the ground, that the networks are there, the networks of civil society organizations, community leaders, religious leaders, and others, and the knowledge of what the context is. So in any case, I think we have a lot to take and learn from each other, but I think it's a very fruitful way forward to see that we can tap into that in that constructive sense, that we're all working towards the same goals, and we're looking for the best tools to be able to achieve it. Thank you.
No, thank you. Katarina, I'd like to ask you a question on Colombia, which I know you consider very important, and indeed it's the main picture on your book. One of our questions from a peace practitioner in Kenya talked about how to address human rights violations in situations where terrorists and extremists are in control. Now, I know, I'm pretty sure that Ahmed wasn't referring to something like FARC, but since I know you found the example of Colombia particularly interesting, aside from the actual motivation of the question, which isn't about FARC, can I turn it to that? Could you say something about addressing human rights violations when guerrilla movements are in control of certain contexts?
Yes, no, thank you so much for that question, and it's a very pertinent and challenging one, and I'm not sure I don't probably have the answer, and maybe the other panelists would also be able to bring about some reflections on that. What was very interesting with Colombia, and just wanted to add to what Ilze Kehris was saying, the importance of the presence of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which had actually been in the country since '97. So at the time of the peace negotiations, the fact that OHHR had been in the country for so many years, had in the conflict affected areas, and having established those contexts and connections and contexts with local communities, was part and parcel of why the office actually became such a trusted actor in the peace negotiations, and was actually invited directly to Havana to bring specific analysis and perspectives directly to the negotiation table, and hence had an influence in the formulation of some parts related to truth and victims' rights in the final peace agreement. And I also wanted to highlight that in that context, the role of women's rights organizations was incredibly important. And I actually wanted to, one of the deficiencies, I think, of my research is that I didn't sufficiently unpack the gender dimensions of peace processes and that specific role of human rights in mediation. But the women's rights organizations became part of that. And actually the Colombian peace process is another unique aspect, is that it has a very, very advanced protection of women's rights in the final peace agreement, thanks in part to that involvement of women's groups in the peace process. But to return to your question on the guerrillas, what was important was a few years before the peace process started, the president at the time, Santos, had actually acknowledged through a specific law, I can't remember now, which made clear that FARC was actually not a terrorist organization, and hence it actually went from the war being a fight against terrorists and the narco cartels to actually acknowledging that it was an armed conflict, and that facilitated then also the comprehensive peace agreement and a comprehensive peace approach to that facilitated work with the mediators. And of course, Colombia is very interesting and unique case in the book because it's actually the only domestically kind of driven mediation, although there were the importance of the UN, but also the guarantor states of Norway and Cuba that facilitated the process. So that's an attempt to answer the complex question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Terry Savage asks a very good question. It's becoming increasingly apparent, increasingly difficult to engage in human rights or mediation without factoring climate degradation and how to respond to this other triple nexus of human rights, peace, and ecological survival. That is a very good question, Terry. And I can say, it sounds a cop-out, but the next book we are coming out with, the next event we'll have, will be on that exact question. The book won't be as good as Katarina's. It's actually me who's writing that one, but I hope we could at least have an interesting discussion, and it will be focused precisely on that. I've received very nice apologetic messages from both other SRSGs from South Sudan, Nicholas Haysom, and Bintu Keita, both who were apparently in the meeting at various times or from the beginning, but it was unable to get through on the link. So they both presented their apologies. And so I just want to, I just flashed up, Bintu might be joining in a minute, but I know they have been struggling ever since they started to try to get the technicalities in Sharjah fixed. So I suspect it may not be, it isn't as imminent as she might have hoped. So with that, since two of our great panelists are unable to attend, I'm going to close it now. And I look forward to other special events, including the one that I just referred to in relation to Terry Savage's question on climate and environmental degradation. So with great thanks to everybody, I now close this meeting. Thank you very much.